Tonight, the White House fending off more attacks, especially from the right, after it negotiated with terrorists to free a prisoner of war held captive by the Taliban for 5 years. Is this criticism valid? Has it made America weaker? Well, history shows us this isn't the first time a U.S. president has negotiated with terrorists or members of a regime. And the feds take aggressive action to combat climate change. And today, the EPA rolling out a new plan to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 30%. Supporters calling it a historic step in the right direction, while critics, they're talking that the bottom line will be hurt in the process. The economy will pay the price. They say the move will destroy jobs and have you paying more for your electricity. Plus, the Working Families Party, they in the end decided to get behind this guy. No, not this guy, Mr. Andrew Cuomo. That after some political wrangling, the party decided to back him even with those concerns. The question is, should the governor be singing Mayor Bill de Blasio's praises? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks for joining us tonight. A lot to get to in the next 60 minutes. And we begin tonight, though, with a look at the federal government and its move to negotiate with terrorists to free a prisoner of war. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, he's being treated and evaluated at a U.S. military hospital in Germany after being held captive by the Taliban for 5 years. Sergeant Bergdahl, he was released in exchange for 5 high-ranking Taliban leaders who are being held at Guantanamo Bay. They are now required to live in Qatar for at least a year. White House says that swapping the Army sergeant for the terrorists was the right thing to do. However, trust me, not everybody is convinced.
Once you start doing it, every other terrorist has an incentive to capture more soldiers.
The number one way that al-Qaeda raises money is by ransom, kidnapping and ransom. We have now set a price.
I think the big issue here is what's going to happen to these 5 individuals. If they re-enter the fight, then it is going to put American lives at risk.
He's a very, very weak president, maybe the weakest, certainly in my lifetime.
Of course, that was Dick Cheney we just heard. We could spend an hour on that guy. All right, but there's a very different scene than the consternation stateside to what we see in Qatar here, where the 5 detainees were greeted by fellow Taliban members. The hugging, the celebration, chanting Muslim prayers and drinking tea. Taliban leader Mullah Omar, who hasn't been seen or heard from for about a decade, he released a letter calling the release a big victory for the entire Afghan Muslim nation. And there is debate tonight, and quite a bit of it, over whether the exchange, forget about whether it was right or wrong or good or bad for America, whether it was legal at all. By law, Congress must be notified 30 days before any prisoner is released from Gitmo. However, the White House said that the president had to act quickly because Bergdahl's health was diminishing. If we take a look back, we will see this isn't the first time that a U.S. president has negotiated with terrorists or members of a regime who could have, of course, forget this moment, when then President Reagan came clean to the American public about the Iran-Contra hostage crisis.
What began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages. This runs counter to my own beliefs, to administration policy, and to the original strategy we had in mind.
But of course, the great communicator was hardly the first president to do so. In '68, President Johnson, LBJ, apologized for spying as part of the negotiations to secure the release of more than 80 American prisoners after North Koreans captured the USS Pueblo. Richard Nixon, he put pressure on Israel, Switzerland, and West Germany to release Palestinian prisoners after 2 airlines were hijacked by the liberation of Palestine. Jimmy Carter, he agreed to unfreeze $8 billion in frozen Iranian assets after more than a year of negotiations with the Iranian revolutionaries. And President Clinton, he met with Hamas, encouraging it to strike a peace deal with Israel. All right, a lot of questions surrounding this and a lot of debate, and I understand really a lot of sides of this one. Let's bring in Michael Lyons. Mike's a retired Army major, military analyst, and a senior fellow at the Truman National Security Project. Michael, welcome.
Great, Richard.
That old axiom, and it's not just words, leave no soldier behind. It gets complicated, though, right? When we're talking about a POW and we're not talking about another nation state here, you're talking about terrorists, because you don't negotiate with terrorists, but you also don't leave one of yours behind in enemy hands. What's the calculation? How does it work that you decide to do or not to do this?
Yeah, I think the calculus from a military's perspective is just that. You leave no soldier behind. I think you listen to the stories of the soldiers that were with him. I mean, Sergeant Bergdahl was not necessarily the best soldier there was. He likely was a deserter. He could possibly come under charges in the future if they do an investigation. But that concept, I think, trumps everything. And I think that's what the president was going by. If a situation of him dying in enemy hands, I think would be completely unacceptable as well. And I think the soldiers in his unit would have said the same thing.
You know, it's interesting because how much of this calculation depends on the soldier himself. If this was somebody that was captured in the course of battle, trying to rescue one of his guys who were pinned down in a firefight, right, we'd probably be having a different conversation. But because he looks like he left his post here and was captured, and as many as 6 soldiers, other American soldiers on patrol to try and find him, died as a consequence of trying to locate him. And then we had commandos risking their lives to try and save him. That becomes more complicated. But take it back to another question. Was it legal? And there's this debate. If you tell too many people in Washington, maybe 2 more people, sure, you can't. This is a mission. If it becomes public, you're going to jeopardize his safety. How about that negotiation? Who do you tell how far in advance?
Yeah, it looks like the president just used executive powers at this point. I think that, again, we could cavil over whether that was true or not. There's even something that says that he wasn't even officially listed as a prisoner of war by the DOD. I mean, this is new kind of warfare.
Yeah.
If this was World War II, the Korean War, he would have been a deserter, likely very quickly brought up on charges. They would have put no effort towards finding him in this regard. But I think, again, in this new military we're in, this new world we live in, our value of American lives, regardless, the president will expense what he thought was most important. 5 detainees that there weren't charges pending against either of them. Clearly, they're 5 bad guys. They'd been in that prison for a very long time. They didn't seem to pose, I don't see them posing an existential threat immediately. Clearly, they could go back and do certain things in Afghanistan. But again, from the short-term perspective, we have an American soldier home, and I think that's all the president looked at.
I think there's legitimate debates about this, but one that I was a little surprised at, which is I see Sunday morning armchair quarterback saying now all of a sudden they're going to be going after try and capture American soldiers. Really? You think the Taliban or Al-Qaeda hasn't been trying for years to try and get an American POW? I mean, this isn't like a new part of the playbook, right?
No, it's not. I think that's one of those kind of straw man arguments that always gets made. There was this old expression that you could always walk the earth as a citizen of Rome and be safe, and I think we all would like to return to those days in the United States, but that's just not the world we live in right now. If you're an American citizen traveling abroad, you're a soldier traveling abroad, you've just got to be careful of your identity and be careful of your security. I don't think that's an issue. This does not mean this is what the value of one person is for 5 prisoners. Now, it brings up many other points. What do we do with the other detainees that are at Gitmo? What's going to happen to them? The president wants to close that. His hands are tied by Congress, basically on what they've said about whether they can move those prisoners or not. It's a deal he made on the side. The question is, what will the results be?
All right. I want to tell you folks at home to weigh in on this one. I got to admit, I'm a little conflicted. I get what the president said, and I certainly defer more to Mike on the military side in terms of leaving no soldier behind here. But at what price, long-term and short-term here? It's a fascinating question. We want you to answer it your own way. Go to Facebook and Twitter and sound off on our question. Was the U.S. right to swap here, basically, with terrorists, give up 5 of them to get 1 of ours back? Now, up next, we're going to bring in the rest of our panel to talk about this and where this goes, not just on the policy front, but the political as well. Stay with us. Our panel will be right back right after this.